Welcome to Growing the Edge special edition with Hema Vyas. Hema's a renowned speaker on heart wisdom, human consciousness, spirituality, health, energy medicine, and the science of Ayurveda. For almost 30 years, she's been practicing as a psychologist and as a life leadership mentor. Her work is about connecting timeless wisdom to solve the problems of modern times, especially by understanding the significance of the heart that she describes as a portal to higher consciousness and to a creative expanse. Welcome to the show, Hema.
Lovely to be here, Chris. Thanks a lot for having me.
So last week's show, we were talking about the topic of trust. And I know that's something that you've spoken about in the past, and it might relate in some way to some of the practices and interests that you have. How do you think we need to really get into the topic and the conversation of trust? What are the basics that we need to cover, do you think?
Well, I think we have to understand that, like all concepts, they're all based on energy. And so when we understand energy and when we understand frequency and resonance, then we understand what it takes to create these qualities in our life. So let me give you an example. So, for example, Chris, if we want to have trust in our life, we have to understand that trust is not just a word, where we can attach different meanings to it. It's actually a frequency and a resonance and energy that hits at the very core of our hearts. And so, if trust means the same thing to me as it means to you, when I use that word, then we're going to vibrate and there's going to be a frequency that resonates, in a way that makes us both feel we can trust each other without necessarily having to use the word. Whereas
So go on. So I was just going to. So what you're saying there is it's almost like a buzz or a vibe that we can that's in there. It's a part of the human condition, but it's something that we're either tuned into or we're not, rather than something that's maybe overtly transactional.
absolutely, absolutely.
So this
Well,
reminds me a little bit of in last week's show, Ben Ford was talking about high performing teams in the military, that they have their backs, each other's backs, and they're kind of tuned into each other. So that sounds again similar type of thing. There's a frequency there.
absolutely. I think it's, when you have a team and everybody's on the same page and everybody knows what it means to have each other's backs, because, again, that's open to interpretation. But, when you've been working together, you've been training together, and you have a team that works together, then chances are they know what the code is, the unspoken code of what it means to really trust each other and to have each other's backs, as you say. And that's so key, isn't it, in any sort of team function?
So I've experienced working in high performing teams in some cases in my working life, not always, but what I took away from that experience is that it felt different. It didn't feel like a normal day at work, and there was an energy, and I couldn't put my finger on it because I hadn't experienced it before. And there was an energy. There was something more than just me as an individual and my other teammates. There was something extra there that we didn't necessarily seek out, but it appeared one day, and it was like, yeah, this is nice. I'd like that to keep going. I suppose I don't always feel that way. And I know a lot of other people may not really experience those things on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if it's something that's natural and it's to do with energy, then what's getting in our way?
In terms of having trust,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I think it's a lot to do with, sort of transparency. I think, if you're in a space where people are quite open, you don't have to overshare about all of your life. You don't need to know everything about each other. But if there's a feeling that people are open, that they're not holding back on something, and, if a question is asked, that people will openly answer it, transparently answer it, or address it in a transparent manner, then I think it builds trust very, very quickly. And also, I think it's about the mark of a person. It's when you're with people, there's just this, like you say, this intangible quality where you just feel this flow. You seem to be on the same page. There's a sort of similarity of thinking, feeling, believing, and I think that adds to that quality of trust. And sometimes it's not there because we come from different spaces and places, we have different backgrounds. And I think that's why it's important to build trust where there is diversity in any way, shape, or form.
And how do you go about, say, if you're working with an organization or a team or a leadership team, how do you go about creating this magical quality?
I think it's something we were talking about before, we jumped on this broadcast. I think it's a lot to do with conversation. The more people feel like they can open up in a safe space, the more you'll find that often people are very much on the same page. In an organization, for example, a lot of people think and feel similar things, they just have different ways of expressing it. And so, one of the things would be really to get people to have open conversations, to be able to express independently and then bring it together, because they're often surprised when they see that there's a lot of shared commonality. So, you're working to build what's common between people, but you're also saying, well, the things that are different, are qualities that are actually going to add to the team environment, and therefore you build trust that way, because it's like, oh, so you're not against me, you're adding to what I'm bringing to the equation. And then all of a sudden, what's different doesn't make for mistrust. What's different suddenly creates space for trust, where this is where I am and there's space for me, and this is where you are and there's space for you.
It sounds a little bit like you're describing a degree of untangling differences and aversions, that maybe sometimes those things they feel like they're the same thing, and that's an illusion, really. And it feels like you're almost sort of, I'm thinking of like a sailing analogy with a marlin spike, which you use to get knots loosened. It feels like you're trying to untangle those things, and then trust can flow out of the braids that are then created when it's untangled.
Absolutely, absolutely. Letting go of the unconscious biases that make us feel like if you're not with me, you're against me, which, obviously creates a sort of sense of mistrust and a need for protection. Anytime there's a lack of trust, people protect themselves. And so there's a shutdown, and a wall comes up, and that wall adds to the level of mistrust. So we build trust by bringing those walls down, and, like you say, untying and untangling that knot, where you see actually it's one rope, and it's just one side or the other side, but it's one rope ultimately.
So it sounds like the possibly the limbic system, the hindbrain, lizard brain, the fear response, oxytocin. It feels like, I don't know my brain hormones very well, but it sounds like those things are kind of involved from what you've said. That there's maybe the fight or flight response is maybe triggered in us when when we're going about our daily lives.
I think so. I think it's fundamental to our lives. We don't realize it's no longer physical in the way that it used to be. It's very much psychological. And I think it's about creating psychological safety at work. And we create psychological safety by, the trust, and recognizing that our bodies are reacting and our hearts are responding. So, if we feel we're threatened in any way, then our body, the fear kind of response kicks in. And once that does, logic kind of leaves. We're not able to be logical or clear minded because emotion takes over. Anytime the fear response is elicited, then the emotion takes over. And that's where, again, it's important to teach people how to come back to center, teach people about the importance of breathing, about understanding their body, understanding their responses and the triggers, that essentially it's the triggers that need to be worked through so that people aren't reacting in the same way.
So working through those seems to then get us on the topic of courage and vulnerability, because it feels like if we're overriding these, very important mechanisms that are built inside us to keep ourselves safe, but maybe they're overfiring, to actually go against that is taking a bit of a risk, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's sort of helping our body to respond differently. But it's, first of all, Chris, I would say most people don't even realize that they're responding in this way. Most people, it's a knee-jerk reaction, and later on they go home and they think, what was that all about? But it's really educating, people, the employees, to understand, the leaders to understand what's really going on in these situations. And this is where, the psychological perspective really comes into play, because it is an important and integral part of all of our being, and we need to engage it. So yeah, to be able to learn about what it means to be vulnerable, and when it's appropriate to be vulnerable, what it means to be courageous and when it's important to be courageous. But those are, wonderful words that get branded around a lot now with leadership especially. And I would say, it's really understanding what they mean.
And I suppose one thing that might be incompatible with that is to do with priorities and timescales and rushing and being busy and things like that. Anything that's to do with pressure, presumably, I mean, we're told that pressure is kind of good for performance, but I guess there's a downside if that pressure then is stimulating that fear reaction.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, the way the body works is that, there's a point where, a lot of adrenaline is good, that pressure, that deadline, you've got to make it happen, and we can all work pretty well under pressure in certain situations. But I think if it's sustained, and, if a voice isn't given to the fact that it might be too much, because we all have different breaking points, and also it depends what's happening in our lives, because it's not just work pressure, and that's the thing that organizations need to recognize. It's not just about what's happening at work, it's also what's happening in people's lives, because we can't compartmentalize. We think we can, but the body doesn't. The body carries the same stress over from the morning breakfast, whatever incidents might have happened, when we go into work and into the meeting. And so, it's really being able to acknowledge that, there's a certain breaking point. How do you identify those breaking points, and what do you do? And it comes back to, really truly giving people a voice and allowing them to be vulnerable enough to say, this is too much for me, without judgment, without criticism, and being able to say, okay, well then what can we do to support you? But if people can't speak, then chances are their bodies will speak. Chances are they'll get to a breaking point, and then they won't be able to cope. And that's where that quality of vulnerability is so essential, where people are able to hold their hand up and say, this is too much for me, or I don't know the answers, or I can't quite cope with this, or whatever it might be, which requires both vulnerability and courage to be able to speak up.
And what sort of messages do you try and give leaders? Because obviously leaders are responsible in some ways for the tone and the atmosphere within their organizations. And I'm guessing that there's a particular role that they can play in this.
Oh, absolutely. I think leaders, need to understand and completely empathize with the people that they're leading, and recognize that, they're all part of the same team. And one person might be the leader, if you like. They might be the person who's, sort of ultimately bringing everything together, bringing everyone together. But they lead by example. You know, they set the tone. And if they act as if, you know, they can keep going and they're invincible or they're invulnerable, you know, then they're going to give a message that it's not okay for others to be, you know, different to them. Again, it comes back to, you know, that sort of shared commonality. And while there is a need for a leader to sort of set themselves slightly apart because people want to look up to the leader, they also need to be able to say, hey, I was there, or I am empathize and I understand. And but this is how I've got to where I've got to. You know, it has to be the bridge between, you know, where they are, where the others might be, and how they can get there. And how they can get there is really being truly honest with themselves and where they're at and how they feel about things. And I think it's really important for leaders to set that tone.
And some people will find that harder than others, I suppose.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's where they need, you know, they need to do a bit of work on themselves, you know, because at the end of the day, we're all human and none of us are kind of infallible and none of us are invincible. And if we're really willing to really work on ourselves, I do think that, you know, we evolve as people. And when we evolve as leaders. And when we evolve as leaders, we're able to lead others to become leaders in their own lives. And I think that's what a good leader is. You know, they lead people to become leaders in their own lives. So they're no longer having to play the role of being a leader. They still will be, but they don't have to play that role because everybody else is sort of, you know, taking on their own roles, managing their own lives and leading their own lives in a really, really kind of, you know, efficient way.
So I suppose some of the experiences that I've had in my line of work are creating, you know, a trustful interaction paradigm between people. You know, and one of the things that I'm interested in is I got some really good advice actually, and from uh, a lady called Jeanette who I worked with a few years ago, and I was maybe a little bit more bolshy at the time, a few years ago, and she gave me took me aside and gave me a bit of advice and said, when you're talking to people, send positive energy. And that like threw me because I wasn't used to it, but I just realized, well, of course. And I was thinking, well, am I not doing that? And I was thinking, oh my word, I'm not, because I'm not focusing on it. And how much effort is it to focus on it? Not very much. Will I get better results? Yes. So there's nothing to lose, is there? And it's like, and I try. Sometimes I forget, but I genuinely try and remember that advice. And what happens is the interaction between people, sometimes the character of it and the nature of it changes. There's less fear or less adversity or less competition, and therefore there's more for everybody else, you know. And that's kind of, I suppose that is getting into the topic of trust, isn't it? It's like, I suppose it's removing one of the barriers, you know, almost assuming good intent would be another one.
Absolutely, absolutely. And because, you know, when you send positive feelings, thoughts, energy, you know, to a situation, I think it creates a sense of, you know, you're there supporting them to be the best, you know, with whatever it is you're trying to, you know, communicate or get them to do, whatever it might be. Because there's an energy, you know, when you're sending out positive thoughts or positive feelings, there's an energy that emanates from you that the other person's able to pick up. And again, it eliminates that threat. And, you know, and that encourages trust. And when the trust is there, I do think that, because for me, you know, the body works in such a way that when we're able to have positive feelings, there's an expansion, which means that we're more receptive to whatever it might be, whether it's an idea, whether it's feedback, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, something I've heard is that in more trustful communications, there's better error handling as well. So I think this was based on some Google research or something like that, which shows that if I say the wrong thing and we have a more trustful relationship, you'll interpret my intent rather than the actual words. But if if the relationship is not so trustful, I can say the right thing, but you might interpret it as the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like there's loads of non-verbal communication going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you know it's about resilience and robustness, and when you have a robust relationship, I think you know then there's more space for things to be said quite bluntly, I guess, you know, or quite sort of obviously, and it's fine. Whereas if there isn't that, then I think there's more need for slightly sort of, you know, softer language or softer ways of expressing things. And I think when we're under pressure, we don't always have time for that. We don't always have time to be nice and thoughtful and kind, you know. But of course, it's about the intent. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that it's embedded in an organization, you know, in a team, that you have that relationship where there is that trust. So then when you're up against it, and if you need to be a little bit snappy, or you need to be a little bit on it and a little bit more abrupt, at least there's no misunderstandings, you know.
Right. So once we've got it, we can play around with it a little bit, and there's room. It becomes almost it's the bond that holds us together in a working context. So presumably, from a lead, if there's some people who are very, very macho old school leaders, and they might think, well, this they may or may not buy into this. If they didn't buy into it, I suppose one angle that I'm interested in is people will work better in this environment. They'll do more. They'll support each other better. The outcomes will be better. But it's predicated on a different sort of mindset to one that's based on just ordering people to do things and telling people. I mean, one thing for me is like listening seems to be like an extremely important part of more modern leadership approaches. You know, there's less telling and more listening.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. You know, if you look at sort of human behavior, the truth is that, you know, anyone can do anything you tell them to do if it's within their range, you know, if it's something they're able to do, they're capable of doing. But what makes them go that, you know, sort of mile further, you know, what makes them go that little bit out of their way to do something is really that bond, and that bond is established through the things that we're talking about, Chris. You know, it's established through having a real sense of trust, and that the intention is right, and that, you know, there are good positive thoughts and vibrations in that space, that, you know, you're all working together collaboratively. You're not trying to get one up on each other. You know, that level of competition that we used to think people thrived on, I don't think we really do. I think competition is something internal rather than external, and that can erode trust. You know, if it's too competitive, it can erode trust, I believe.
Yeah, and also if it's too competitive, we can lock ourselves into a zero-sum game rather than an infinite game, which is, you know, something people talk about quite widely. I wouldn't mind just sharing a few experiences. We just chatted briefly before the call. So I was fairly late to the leadership game, and my first foray into that was running a team about 7 years ago, where I inadvertently ended up running a team. And before that, I was a techie, and I was working on project, and some of the project managers, you know, a couple of project managers dropped out in quick succession. I thought, well, I'll have a go, and I inadvertently led a team of about 10 people for about 18 months. And what I learned from that experience was I didn't need to prove myself, because I already felt quite confident about the task I was doing, and I was more intrigued by what they would do. So what I realized in hindsight is I just removed this huge burden, unnecessary burden from myself to need to prove myself or something like that. I just didn't bother. I felt, yeah, I know how to do this. I wonder what they'll make of it. And what I ended up doing is, for the first couple of weeks, it was like solid listening. And I remember getting home and I was exhausted because I'd listened all day, and I felt, well, that was much harder than I expected. That was harder than writing a document. It was to like just kind of be receptive, you know. And what I found is that the listening was almost like, in some cases it was almost enough, and I was like shocked at how people had this huge need to be listened to, and once they've been listened to, it's like their productivity improved, their morale improved, all of these things. And then what I realized is my job was literally to listen to them, give them the occasional bit of advice, and then crack the odd joke. And I did that for 18 months, and we won an industry award. And I was like shocked because actually it was based on listening and cracking a couple of jokes, and that was enough, because they did all the work, but all they needed was that they needed that receptivity, to allow them to do what they had in them, and it was like a real educational, it made me completely rethink, because I was used to being, the person who would have the idea and all, and I just realized that was really an illusion that I'd created, and that what I had to offer was really just, the main thing I had to offer was receptivity, and then everything else could be would be handled, and that was quite an eye opener.
That's such a wonderful story, but I think you're slightly being really humble about yourself, because what I notice about you, Chris, and it's the first time we've met today, but what I notice about you is that you're really, really good at really hearing. You're not just listening to what somebody's saying and relaying it back to them. You're really hearing what they're saying beneath their words, and so you're able to put it in another context, which is what makes people really feel they've been heard. It's not just them speaking and speak, because they can just speak to anybody, right? It's about the fact that you like you say, you're receptive, you really listen, you really hear, and when they really feel they've been heard, something inside of them breathes. They're able to breathe that little bit better, and that is part of what adds to productivity, because when they're able to breathe better, they've got more space to go out into the world and do what they've got to do. And if they're holding it in, then they can't. But it's not just somebody who's going, okay, I'm going to give you an hour and you can talk to me and just talk at me. They want to hear, listen, they want to be heard in such a way that somebody's listening and really understands. And more importantly, I think, they really empathize. And I think that's a quality that you very naturally bring to a space. And that's
Uh,
probably what was a key thing.
yeah, thank you. I think it was probably because I'd got good at technology, so I could do that already. So I had
Yeah,
that T-shirt. So I was after the next challenge, and people are obviously far more complicated, interesting technology than what I was used to dealing with. So it was really the challenge that I relished, and I think what I've also learned is, as well as people need to be able to be understood, is people are a lot more interesting, complex, and intelligent and creative than I'd realized. It's like everybody is like really interesting and smart and innovative, and have got all of these interesting, subtleties and hidden skills and abilities. And it's like everybody does, every single person. And it's like in many organizations, it feels that we're missing that, aren't we? We're missing taking advantage of all of that human capital that we have. It's like we've got this cornucopia of human capital, and it's maybe we're not really seeing it.
absolutely. I really love that. I really love that, because that's really essentially my work, is that, for so long people have been treated as a role. This is your role, and so that's who you are. And you just, hit the nail on the head. No, I mean, there's so much more to people, and we're so incredibly complex, and we're so three-dimensional and beyond, and so therefore, we've got to start really, really, utilizing that, because that is actually our greatest asset. People are our greatest assets for any organization, for any community, for any society, for any world.
And this is another thing that I think can be great about these bring your whole self to work initiatives. Now they're not necessarily for everybody, and sometimes it can we can take things too far. But what I've noticed is that it's a way of really bringing the person into sharp focus. It almost feels like without that, all we're doing is we've got this blurred picture of somebody, and then once we get this sharp focus, then it just opens up all these opportunities. I mean, the number of people at work with interesting hobbies and hidden talents and strange pets and and hidden challenges in their life, and it's like all over the place, and it suddenly it's a bit it suddenly shows that work is far more. We spend a lot of time at work, most people, and it just shows that maybe we've been approaching it again in slightly the wrong way. We haven't really been seeing work as an extension of our lives. It's been more to do with maybe a mask that people wear and a constraint that they fit within, rather than it's just an extension. And it's not like it's not like we haven't had the evidence. I think the challenge though is to take that into more mainstream organizations. So obviously, if we're in a a loft in Shoreditch, maybe it's easier to kind of see those sorts of things. But if we're in a large office block, or even like lockdown or something like that, maybe that brings it into more stark relief. But I suppose it's there too. There's no less. It's a bit like, they talk about, there's no less, if enlightenment on top of a mountain as there is, in the checkout at Sainsbury's. It's just our perspective presumably that's the same thing, isn't it? That it's not that we have to be in a cool loft with a slide in the office.
Right.
It's like everywhere, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think more and more organizations are waking up to it, because, it's like you say, Chris, when you get to a certain point, you realize, well, then what else is there? So you've mastered something, and that's part of leadership, when you've mastered, the technology side or the finance side or whatever it is that you're doing, and you climb up the ranks. And I think the next thing is really about learning about people and really bringing them out. So you bring out the best of them, so that you go from just a team that on paper looks good, but that actually in reality outperforms how they look. Because one of the things that I say is that we are greater than the sum of all our parts. And that is true for organizations and for teams, specifically. But I couldn't agree more that, it's enlightenment happens anywhere, because it's really about, that shift in perception and that sort of 3D view of life and about reality. So we're no longer singly focused. We're no longer just thinking about this job or this role or this life. We're thinking about how it impacts the whole.
So it's a bit like playing the piano with two hands, isn't it? We've got to play it with two hands. It's like one hand is doing the task, and the other hand is looking at these other factors that we might call energies or vibes or emotions or other hormones or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Reminds me a little bit of an article I read yesterday about Apple. So executives at Apple, they divide their work into 4 quadrants, and they're very keen on having leaders who come from an area of expertise. So they like having experts, as teaching experts how to lead, rather than having managers per se who only manage. And one of the approaches they have is they have this quadrant approach. So each of their leaders will have things that are in the own quadrant, and it's to do with their how involved they are, how in depth they're involved, and also their level of expertise. So those are the two axes. And in one quadrant, they've got the things that they own, where they want to be in depth, that they have in depth expertise, and they're getting into the detail. Then there's the things they're teaching, where they have the in depth expertise, but they're not getting into the detail. They're leaving it to others. There's the things they're learning, where they've got the in-depth involvement but not the expertise, and the things they're delegating, where they're neither of those things. And I quite like that model because it's talking about people are encouraged to be first among equals. They're still on the shop floor. They're never leaving. Part of them is never leaving the shop floor. It's not an ivory tower. It's, people are there to learn. A leader is there to learn as well as to teach or mentor. And I quite like that model, and it relates to something that I'm very, very keen on, which is the idea of like flattening our outlook when it comes to how we deal with people interpersonally, regardless of job titles and org structures and things like that. People are people at the end of the day.
Absolutely. That's a great model. And it sort of inherently has vulnerability as part of its core, right? Because you're already saying I'm not the perfect person who has all quadrants covered. These are my sort of, the best attributes and the best skills, and then these are the ones that I'm, doing something different with. And that's so important because we all have our own space where we belong. And when we work collaboratively, we realize, well, this is my strength, this is your strength. And how can my strength bring out your strength? And how can your strength bring out my strength? And that's what you're talking about, right? With that sort of approach where you identify. And it's not always so black and white, I think. But I think you pretty much fall into one category more than another. And it's being able to identify, and it requires a level of self-awareness. And so, I think there's a lot that goes into these things that, we take for granted. So, for example, like, for a good leader, I think they also have to be self-aware, because I know I've done tests in the past, psychometric testing, where people are not really aware of who they are. They get their own profiles quite wrong because they think they're one thing, and then when you really really look at their history or how they work or what they do, you realize, well, maybe that's not quite where their strengths lie. But I love that approach, that making sure that they've got the quadrants covered.
Yeah, and do you find that with the people you work with, are you to what extent are you leading them, and to what extent are they curating their own journey?
I definitely think it's sort of both, that, because I think I can only lead to the extent that they're able to open up and share with me, be it verbally or non-verbally, what's really, really going on, because on where they are and where they need to be. But if they're able to be really open enough, then I am able to guide them towards where they want to be on a deeper level, like on a heart level, rather than a mind level. Because the mind might think, well, I want to do this and I want to be this and I want to have this and I should be good at this. But, the heart knows the truth. And that's what I always say is, and that's why, I'm able to help bring out a person's heart energy, able to bring out what's really, really inside of their heart, so that they are able to live the best life possible for them. And so I think it's a co-creating journey where, it's not about what I want for them or what I think they should be. It's about where I know deep down inside they want to be, but they haven't either recognized it, they're not self-aware enough, or they haven't been able to voice it, or they haven't been given the opportunity. So it's really an opportunity for, me to sort of speak to what they really are saying to me, and be able to bring it out so that they can find their way.
So if you were just thinking, I'm just trying to be a bit naughty here. So just to try and find a little scenario. Say if you just found yourself parachuted into a meeting, and you've got 10 people in a meeting, and they're talking, and they don't seem to be getting in anywhere, and you're a fly on the wall. What are you thinking? What's your thought process, or your heart energy process?
It's absolutely my strength, that's exactly where I absolutely accelerate. So what happens, Chris, is that, I do exactly what you do, which is, if I'm in a room and there's 10 people and they're all speaking, or they're all, trying to get to something, I really do just listen, and really, really listen to what's really being said beneath the words, what's really being said beneath the emotions, what's really being felt beneath the emotions, what's really being expressed that's not being expressed. And then I'm able to very, very succinctly say exactly what's going on for people, exactly where they are, exactly where they want to be, and how they can do it, and who needs to be doing what. Because that is the beauty of heart energy. Because when you're able to tap into the heart energy, it is that skill where you're able to listen beyond words, and what is being said beneath words is so much more powerful than the words we use, because the words are limited, but energy is not, it's infinite. And the truth is that, if you've got 10 people in a room, my feeling and my thing would be that they all want to get to the same place. They just don't know it. And so I go in to really help them to get to that place by actually naming it and identifying it, and saying it in a way that they can all agree, because that's what I do, is I'm the connector. And that's what the heart is. It's a connector, and it connects all different points of views and different beliefs and different thoughts to get to the same place, which is, and I mean that because if it was a room full of 10 people, then chances are they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
It's not what I would be able to do with 10 different random people just, off the street, but it's what I would be able to do in a situation where clearly there was some sort of goal that they were working towards, whether they recognized it or not.
Because I find, in my experience, almost everybody is trying to do a good job. Very occasionally you get some people playing some politics and things like that, but it seems to be much rarer than people would think. It's normally based on different interpretations or misunderstandings or things like that. I wouldn't mind just throwing in a little bit of a technique that I found myself using recently, which is not necessarily to do with heart energy, but it's related. So, when we were talking about the Marlin spike, and like, the aversion and the difference, and the fact that they may be coupled together, and that's maybe, not necessarily the case. I found that can be the case in the way people talk about aspects of the work, particularly with unstated assumptions, and how the unstated assumptions may well be tangled up in a way that needs untangling. So I don't know, go all nerdy, but there's a guy called Goldratt. He's deceased now, and he's got this theory of constraints. And there's the theory of constraints model, or TOC. There's this technique called evaporating clouds. And if we want A, then I think for A, I need B, and you think we need C. And B has its set of constraints and assumptions, and so does C, but we're not exploring those. We're only talking about B and C. So we're disagreeing on the B and C. Yeah. But actually the reason we're disagreeing, what Goldratt says, is the reason we're disagreeing on the B and C. There's going to be the heart energy stuff as well. There's also, it can be the case that there's a way we can both be right, but we need to understand what our unstated assumptions are. We need to state those assumptions, get it out in the open, and then explore. Just because I want one thing, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to come with this thing. Maybe I can pull those apart a little bit. And that's the example that he gives, in the literature around batch sizes in manufacturing. But I've often found that people, it's what they're not talking about, as well as the heart energy stuff. It's even at the more cognitive level, the stuff they're not talking about, the assumptions. Once you get those on out into the open, we can explore those and tinker around with it and get something so everybody's happy. And it's not necessarily being compromised. It can be genuinely being creative and finding a breakthrough that, people are wanting things that they can both have. They just need to try and explore. But that again talks to the narrative point, doesn't it? The fact that we need to talk more rather than less, to get to the bottom of these things.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think we're talking about the same thing, the assumptions, whether it's cognitive, whether it's something that's conscious or unconscious. It's about bringing it out to the surface. And I think often people don't even realize that there are unconscious biases, or they don't realize that there are assumptions that are keeping them separate. And that's where the sort of awareness comes in. And that's where it's lovely when somebody comes in who's able to sort of read the room and able to understand what's being said without being said.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite techniques is to drift in and out a little bit. And I should be attentive, but after a while it can be quite exhausting. And so I drift in and out, and sometimes that's my confession live on air. But what I find is humor can be really, really important. And particularly what I love about humor is the thicker the atmosphere, the easier the jokes are, because you've got something to play against. I mean, we're going to struggle because we're on this nice vibe, so there's not so much tension in there. But if there was 6 of us and it was all a bit tense, there's room for humor. And I often think humor is this great grounder and liberator of people's levels of interaction and trust. And I'm always looking for a little angle that I can exploit to do that, and it seems to be that's my little private shortcut.
Absolutely. Yes, it's such a stress reliever, isn't it? Because if there's a lot of tension, people are just looking for a reason to laugh or to just, breathe again, and just, release whatever tension's housed. So I think that's a really good thing. But I'm sure you have to be careful, because when it's really tense, sometimes it can be taken the wrong way as well.
Yeah, and I've also I do make mistakes with that as well. Yeah, exactly. I'm just thinking in terms of just trying to think of some themes to kind of to take us towards a kind of a landing here. Would it be very interesting? I mean, you seem quite a calm, patient person. And I'm just wondering, is that something that have you always been that way? And is it a prerequisite of the work you're doing, or have you come to that through not being that way? That would be kind of interesting, because I think a lot of people who are in your line of work, it's like, well, how do I become more like that? Is it just an innate thing, or is it something you cultivated?
And I definitely have cultivated who I've become, but of course, there's an innateness to, some of the skills and natural inclinations that I had, and psychology was definitely one of them. People was another one. The ability to really, really empathize and really feel people and read the room. These are things that were already there, but a lot of it's been cultivated. I think calmness. Comes from a real trust, you know, coming back to where we started, it's that, you know, I think what's really grown in me is a real ability to trust my truth no matter what. And that gives me the ability to be able to sit back or stand back, but also speak up when necessary. So although I seem really, really calm and, you know, quite sort of gentle sort of disposition, you'll be surprised. I can, you know, roar like a lion, or lioness, I should say, because, you know, sometimes it's required. Sometimes, you know, you've got to be able to speak up, and you've got to be able to stand in your truth and in your power without overbearing, without being overly powerful. It's not about overpowering other people. It's about really, really knowing that who you are and what you believe and what you trust, you can back up with experience, and you can back up with all the things that you have done. And so I know that my knowledge and what I speak about and what I speak, where I speak from, comes from a deep, deep place of trust in myself. And that hasn't always been there by any means.
And that almost seems like there's a little bit of a personal morality angle coming in there. You know, it sounds like it's to do with, you know, fighting or acting from a position of internal strength and a core of some description.
That's right. Absolutely. That's exactly what I would say.
You know, I had an old boss of mine and a mentor, Jatin, gave me a great bit of advice. I got some great bit of advice about the same period, about 5-6 years ago. He said, always do the right thing, but don't expect the right outcome. And that was something that I'd missed, because I would always hope something would happen in a certain way. It wouldn't, and then I would be devastated, and I'd feel this sense of responsibility. And I realised that was, again, not being in touch with my core, of saying, well, actually my core is not about the outcome. The core is about my intent, and that's all it is, isn't it? And then I don't control everything. All I can do is be in touch with my intent, and then trust the universe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is that intention and that trust and letting go of the outcome that I think is what allows others to trust you, because you're not trying to control an outcome, because it might be different to what they want, and it might be different to what's needed. But if they can trust that your intention is to get to the best possible outcome, for example, while you are doing the right thing for the right reasons, then I think, I mean, yeah, absolutely, there's so much trust to be had there in that space.
Well, I think this is probably a lovely point to finish. So, Hema, Vyas, thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you. Thank you for having me today.